The Hamas have made approximately $500 million in profit from the black market in the aid they have stolen since October 7.
Wow.
Across the world, when nations go to war, the average is 1 to 9. 9 civilians for every combatant killed. 1 to 1 is unheard of. No country in the world has ever managed to reduce the number of civilians killed in the way that Israel has. And yet Israel is being accused by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court of willfully killing civilians. International law and human rights law has not stopped any of these things. It's not stopped Putin. It's not stopped China from oppressing its own Uyghurs and others. It's not stopped Assad in Syria from killing untold hundreds of thousands of people. It doesn't stop tyrants. ICC has always been a political court. That's why human rights law has now, unfortunately, generally, human rights culture, human rights law, human rights institutions, the ICC, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the United Nations, all the big NGOs, non-governmental organizations that deal with human rights, they've all been captured by an ideology which basically says Jewish state of Israel must go. The Tories, I mean, they're not for nothing where they're called the stupid party. They really, really, really are stupid. Do I think that Britain and the West are going to survive?
Hello and welcome to the Winston Marshall Show with me, Winston Marshall. I sat down with Times columnist and author Melanie Phillips. We discussed, amongst other things, the war in Israel, what the protests across the West mean for the West. We talked about universalism. Melanie wants to abolish the United Nations. That's not the most controversial thing she even said in this interview, so you must listen to the whole thing. She's giggling now and off screen, off camera. Before you listen to Melanie, I ask if you want to support the show, all you have to do is press subscribe. If you press the subscribe button, I can have more phenomenal guests like Melanie discussing the issues that you want to hear about. But without further ado, Melanie Phillips. Thank you for watching the Winston Marshall Show. Melanie Phillips, what a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you. I'm not sure I've ever had a guest who's published so many deep writings and on so many different topics. There's so many things we could cover today, and the difficulty here wasn't trying to find questions for you. The difficulty was trying to whittle them down. I've managed to whittle it down to 5 pages, which I'm sure we're not going to be able to get through. I'm keen to get through your recent Times article about the ICC, but before that, I'm going to ask a very broad question, if you don't mind. Since the Gaza war started October 7th, we have seen here in London marches almost every week, starting from October 9th, or even there's activity on October 8th, even on October 7th. We've seen at university campuses from Columbia down to University of Texas, here in Britain, Oxford to Cambridge, we've seen encampments of students protesting Israel's war. I wondered what you thought that those marches and those encampments can tell us about the West today, what they can tell us about Britain and America today.
Well, first of all, I'm a British Jew, although I spend a lot of time now, most of my time now in Israel, but I'm in Britain a great deal. And I'm still very, very concerned with and affected by what's going on in Britain. And for Jewish people in Britain, these demonstrations, what they're saying, what they represent, what they look like, it's hard to exaggerate the despair and sense of abandonment and isolation and fear that has gripped the Jewish community through these demonstrations. Because to me, and I speak for many in the Jewish community in Britain in saying this, although there are some who obviously would disagree. But for me, what they represent is not just a protest at a foreign war in which they are taking one side against another. The people are entitled to protest. People are entitled to protest about the policies of the State of Israel, just as they're entitled to protest about anything. People are entitled to have their view. But this isn't that kind of protest. These are demonstrations which, let's not forget, started on October the 7th, while the Hamas stormtroopers were still engaged in murdering, in slaughtering, in raping, in beheading, in burning alive women, children, and men in southern Israel, in great number. While that was still going on, people in Britain took to the streets in ecstatic celebration. It wasn't a protest, it was an ecstatic celebration that finally they were killing Jews. Finally, they thought they were going to destroy Israel. And finally, they were on the way to overturning Western civilization. That's what came out. In subsequent weeks and months, we've seen these demonstrations all the time. And to a Jew, and to many who are non-Jews, but who are looking at this in horror, they are demonstrations of power play, and hatred, and incitement to hatred and violence. In large measure because of what they're saying. Some of the slogans are screamed in Arabic, but we all now know surely what they say. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is not some kumbaya expression of let's all live together in a happy unity, Jews and Muslims and Arabs together. No. What it means is Palestine, as they would put it, i.e. the entire state of Israel, should be free of Jews. In Arabic, the slogan is, I think, from the river to the water, Palestine will be Arab. That's what it actually says. They're saying, globalize the intifada. It doesn't matter whether people who are screaming this know what they're saying even. But what it actually means is the intifada was a murderous campaign, a campaign of mass murder against Israeli Jews. And other Israelis also were taken up in that, where other Israelis were targeted and slaughtered. But nevertheless, it's basically against Zionists, which is basically Jews. And globalize the intifada means let's kill Jews everywhere. Now, if you're a British Jew and you're hearing this screamed every week, and you also have experience, or not a personal experience, but you hear of what's going on, that people on these demonstrations are being assaulted, and that if you are a counter-demonstrator, if you stand up as this one chap who is not a pro-Israel supporter per se, he's an anti-Iranian regime supporter, an anti-Iranian regime protester. And Iran, the Iranian regime, is behind the Hamas, another story. So he's on these demonstrations as a counter-demonstrator.
This is the guy with the Hamas is terrorist sign.
He gets arrested. Famously or infamously, a campaigner against antisemitism, Gideon Falter, deliberately went across the street where there was one of these demonstrations taking place and was told by the police, you are openly Jewish and therefore you have to be removed. And if you don't go, you'll be arrested. And we can discuss the reasons for that. But if you're a Jewish person, you can see that you are not going to be protected. You're going to be arrested for daring to exercise your rights as a free person in Britain. And consequently, British Jews feel, who is going to stand up for us? The police aren't going to protect us. They're clearly not protecting us. We as British Jews feel we cannot safely go into central London in the ambit of these demonstrations when they're taking place. The government makes nice noises about, this is appalling, we can't stand anti-Semitism, but they're doing absolutely nothing. And there's this feeling of the entire world, the Western world, rising up, promulgating lie after lie after lie about Israel, which is inciting hatred. Because if you believe what's being said about Israel, you would also hate Israel. because what's being said is basically, it's painting the Jews of Israel, the Israelis per se, as some sort of demonic, diabolical conspiracy against decency, when in fact they are resisting genocide. Because the attacks of October 7, terrible as they were, barbaric and savage as they were, people don't realize what actually happened on that day. It wasn't just that people were killed. They were killed and slaughtered in the most appalling way. But the Hamas have said, we will repeat this over and over again until Israel is destroyed. And consequently, the idea that the legitimate defense against genocide, which any other country would undertake, and would go to war to defeat this force that's threatening it. The idea that if Israel does it, alone among nations, if Israel does it, that itself is called genocide, that Israel cannot wage a just war, that it therefore is in the wrong. No other country in the world is treated like this. And so the Jewish community thinks, are we living in a completely upside-down universe? Has everybody gone mad? And people feel very abandoned as a result.
That segues nicely into what you've written about the ICC and how Israel are treated on the international by the international community. The ICC, and specifically a British lawyer and prosecutor at the International Criminal Court named Karim Khan, has just requested the arrest warrants of both Netanyahu and Israel's Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, as well as senior members of Hamas, Sinwar Mohammed Deif and Ismail Haniyeh. I'm not sure I've pronounced those correctly. So you have written in protest, or rather against this. And so my question, I guess maybe you could color in exactly what's happened a little bit for listeners. But my question will be, is the ICC fit for purpose?
The answer to your question is no. And in my view, it was never fit for purpose. This is a longer discussion about the role of international law, the way in which human rights culture, the human rights law, has been deployed as a weapon specifically against Israel over many years.
You've gone further than that, because you've said human rights law are causing, quote, such injustice and denial of human rights. So you did this recently at the National Conservative Conference, I believe.
Yes.
You have a big problem, generally speaking, with multinational institution and multinational...
I do. So perhaps we can take this in two parts. Yes. First of all, the court, and secondly, the human rights culture that's behind the court. Mm-hmm. So the International Criminal Court has had a very difficult career so far. Karim Khan's two predecessors as prosecutor were appalling, absolutely incompetent, useless, and brought the reputation of the court really down. And so it's kind of in the last chance saloon. And Karim Khan knows that. He is by all accounts, a very cautious man, very aware that he has to rescue the reputation of the court.
Sorry, Melanie, you have to fill me in. What did they do that brought down the reputation?
They dragged their heels over people who should be prosecuted and spent a great deal of time trying to persecute Israel, which is the one democracy in the Middle East. They were partisan and incompetent. It's a whole different story. But basically, Karim Khan was very much aware that he had to restore the court's reputation as an impartial court of law. And consequently, to me and to many others, we were astonished by what he's just done for these reasons. First of all, to draw the equivalence that he drew between Netanyahu and the Israelis on the one hand, who are defending their country against genocide and fighting a just war, to equate them with the people who are trying to perpetrate the genocide, who committed the atrocities of October 7, who are still holding more than 130 Israelis hostage, however many of those are still alive, we don't know, and who are threatened more. To equate the two, the perpetrators of genocide and the defenders against it is obscene. That's the first thing. The second thing is that he did it in his request for the arrest warrant by deploying all the lies that are the boilerplate of people who want Israel destroyed. They are lies. Every single one of them is a lie. So, for example, the lie that Israel is, or Israel's defense forces are deliberately inflicting starvation upon the people of Gaza is gainsaid immediately by the hundreds of trucks and hundreds of tons of food that have gone in since the beginning of the war. The lie that Israel has...
And it's Hamas, in fact, who are...
And it's Hamas who are stealing the aid. And according to one analyst, supported by the Shin Bet analysis, Israel's security service, the Hamas have made approximately $500 million in profit from the black market in the aid they have stolen since October 7.
Wow.
And they've used the aid also for themselves.
How is anyone monitoring that? How could anyone possibly know
I
that?
cannot tell you, but people are putting things together. They know how much has come in. They know what's being sold on the black market. And you only have to go on YouTube to see Gazans, ordinary Gazans, protesting and denouncing Hamas for stealing the aid from them, both for their own use, which enables them to continue to wage their war of terror, and also to sell on the black market at such inflated prices ordinary Gazans can't afford it. So that's what's been going on. And so Karim Khan's also accuses Israel of willfully killing Gazan civilians. Now that is what we would call in the Jewish community a blood libel. It is a libel, and it accuses Israel or the Israelis of being demonic, literally willfully killing civilians. Now, what's that based on? It's based on Hamas statistics, which Hamas itself no longer uses. Everybody in the Western media says, 35,000 plus civilians have been killed in Gaza, of whom the vast majority are women and children. That fact has incited hatred of Israel, hatred of Jews who support Israel.
There's various problems. Go on.
Over time, over the last few months, experts came forward, statisticians, and said these figures are statistically impossible. They've been made up. And so authoritative were these criticisms that the Hamas itself, the Hamas-run health ministry that was producing these statistics, quietly downgraded its own figures, lowered the numbers, and said, we've taken some of these numbers from the media. Hello? This was not reported in the British media at all. Lo and behold, May the 8th, the United Nations, which had hitherto used the Hamas-run health ministry figures as authoritative, the UN quietly, without saying anything, halved its estimate of the number of Gazan civilians killed. Halved it. As a result...
I don't think that's actually quite accurate, sorry. I think they halved the number of women and children, but not the actual total number.
The total number was I think, generally half.
Because it
was half the number.
They kept it around the 35,000 mark, but they lowered down the number.
They then tried to massage it. They then tried to say, well, the figure of 35,000 remains. It's just that we can't identify some of them. Mm-hmm. But the lack of identification means that they just don't know. Mm-hmm. So anyway, the fact was they greatly reduced the figure without telling anybody. Now, the crucial thing is this. Even if you adopted the original Hamas figures of 35,000, and certainly if you reduce it by whatever, Israel estimates that it's killed approximately 14,000 terrorists. Now that works out, I'm not very good at doing this on the top of my head, but it works out at approximately 1 point something to 1 civilian to combatant killed. Now, across the world, when nations go to war, the average is 1 to 9. 9 civilians for every combatant killed. 1 to 1 is unheard of. no country in the world has ever managed to reduce the number of civilians killed in the way that Israel has. And yet Israel is being accused by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court of willfully killing civilians. Now, that is a wicked lie. So, those are the things that he did. And the final thing I would say about the criminal court, what he's done, is the criminal court, the International Criminal Court, has a bedrock foundational principle. It does not have jurisdiction. In other words, it doesn't get involved in a state's affairs if the state itself is willing to investigate or has the capacity to investigate the charges that are being laid against it. And because of that fact, the ICC must give the state time to investigate the claims that the ICC is making against it. Now, it hasn't given Israel any time. The prosecutor went ahead and just issued his request for the arrest warrants. And it couldn't have given Israel time because Israel is still in the middle of the war. It can't address these claims because the war is still going on. So what Karim Khan has done is to ride a coach and horses through the foundational principle of the criminal court, of the International Criminal Court. So that's the criminal court. Mm-hmm. On human rights, I have long been an opponent of, I put it in inverted commas, human rights, because these are presented as universal human rights. And in fact, they are not universal. They are highly contingent. They are created as a result of documents, conventions drawn up by people, and they are arbitrated by judges. For every human right, there is a contrary right. It depends entirely on the judges arbitrating between these things, which I think is dubious in itself because it allows the court to play politics. Secondly, it relies on a body of law which is international. In other words, it's not fixed to any one nation's jurisdiction. Now, to me, law has the force and authority that it does because it comes from a nation. A nation expresses its culture through the laws which define the boundaries of what's acceptable and not acceptable in that culture. Those laws are drawn up in a democracy by democratically elected representative bodies called parliaments. Those are the laws of the nation, and they have validity because they're fundamentally founded in the consent of the people of that nation, and they express the culture and traditions of that nation.
Okay, can I make a counter to that, which is that, let's say, hypothetically, although I think there have been examples of this, you are a young woman in Iran or in Afghanistan under the Taliban, under the Iranian regime.
Yeah.
And there have been examples where these women appeal to international human rights in order to deal with the oppression that they face themselves. So is that not an example of when it's good that we have?
In principle, absolutely. And that's why it was invented in the first place. It was invented basically mainly by Jews and others, but between the wars and especially after the war, on the basis that by definition, because of the terror of the Nazi terror, and because even before the Nazi terror, the oppression of Jews in Eastern Europe, the pogroms and so on, by definition, the nation's structures of the structures of those nations could not be relied on to administer justice. By definition, they were not administering justice, and therefore, in order to protect these minorities, the international community had to get together and make laws. That was the whole purpose of it, a noble purpose. But in fact, it doesn't work like that because tyrants don't accept any of this. International law and human rights law has not stopped any of these things. It's not stopped Putin. It's not stopped China from oppressing its own Uyghurs and others. It's not stopped Assad in Syria from killing untold hundreds of thousands of people. It doesn't stop tyrants. And what was said at the time that international human rights law was being devised, for the most noble of reasons, was that if you don't anchor it in a nation's culture and its parliaments, if it's detached from a nation, if it's a free-floating thing, then it's going to be captured by politics. it's going to be a political court. And that's why the ICC has always been a political court. And that's why human rights law has now, unfortunately, generally, human rights culture, human rights law, human rights institutions, the ICC, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the United Nations, all the big NGOs, non-governmental organizations that deal with human rights, they've all been captured by an ideology which basically says the Jewish state of Israel must go. And that's why we see this, all these human rights institutions are viciously anti-Israel because human rights has become a political instrument of the attempt to destroy Israel.
If I can illustrate the absurdity, I don't know if you've seen this, but the European Court of Human Rights have just ruled against the Swiss government because 2,000 women over 64 claimed that climate change was affecting their health, and they won the case. The Swiss government now has to implement policy and recompense the legal fees of these 2,000 women. So that's an example of how absurd this has got. But my question would be, what's the alternative? Are you saying abolish all of these things? And what's the best way for nations to deal with such injustices?
What I'm about to say will perhaps shock you to the core, and it will shock everybody who subscribes to the unchallengeable view that there is nothing worse than war, ever. War has to be avoided, and that's why you do law. That's why you do human rights law. What do you put in its place? You put in its place national, the laws of democratic nations. I mean, the idea, for example, if Britain were to, come out of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is a matter of some discussion at the moment, and everybody says, this would be appalling, it would mean we have no human rights anymore. Excuse me? Britain invented liberty, political liberty, a tradition that has been enshrined in the common law, the most liberty-fulfilling doctrine ever. And in my view, liberty in Britain has been much constrained by the impact of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is man-made law arbitrated by judges, which sets one set of so-called rights which actually demands against another set of so-called rights which actually demands, and someone then loses. So I think that democratic nations should make their own laws, but we were not talking about democratic nations, clearly. You're talking quite rightly about the problem that arises in non-democratic nations which oppress people, which really oppress people. And for that, human rights law does not give us the ability to hold these people to account. It's happened once or twice. Milosevic was brought to justice. But it's very, very, very rare. Most tyrants get away with it. How does one stop Putin? One has to fight him. How does one stop China? One has to fight it. Not necessarily through war. You can do it by economic sanctions. You do it by excluding them from the community of civilized nations. How do you fight Iran? We have this enormous human rights infrastructure. Iran is about to get the nuclear bomb, and Iran is threatening genocide. It might already have it. It's threatening genocide against Israel, and it's threatening war against the West. How does one stop that? Through the Human Rights Court? Excuse me? This is absurd. How does one stop the terrible oppression of the Iranian people, particularly Iranian women, who are beyond heroic in the attempt have been making over many years to oppose the regime? I mean, the idea that international human rights law has any effect on any of that is ridiculous. If we in the West want to stop that, and we should be taking condign action against Iran. We should have starved it of money. We should have starved it of all diplomatic connections. We should have made it a pariah nation. We should have bankrupted it. We should have brought the regime to its knees. We choose not to say that, not to do that. We choose instead to appease it through America, through Britain, in various ways. We have chosen collectively to appease it to finance it by funneling vast amounts of money into it. And then we as the West have the audacity to say that we actually support human rights because we subscribe to the European Convention on Human Rights and we support the ICC and the ICJ and the UN. I mean, what hypocrisy is this? What planet are people living on?
When did it go wrong? In do you think, as you say, it started after the Second War? Can you pinpoint a specific point where it went, of course, or was it flawed from the beginning?
Well, I think it was fundamentally flawed from the beginning conceptually. As I say, there were one or two people at the time who perceived that if you had a free-floating set of laws not anchored in a national jurisdiction, you would end up oppressing the wrong people. You would end up prosecuting the wrong people, I should say, and letting the people who should be prosecuting off the hook. So that was seen from the beginning. So the conceptual flaw was there from the beginning. But in practice, when it went wrong, I would say would be around the 1970s or so. That sort of era, when I think two things happened which were connected. The United Nations started to become dominated by I think they're called the non-aligned nations, which were basically radical Marxist. It was a radical Marxist view, which basically divided the world into oppressor and oppressed. The West was the oppressor.
That was infiltrated the UN.
Yes, because the countries of the UN, the UN expanded its number. It didn't start off as what it is now. I've forgotten how many countries it is now, but it was much, much smaller. Anyway, a whole bunch of nations sort of came on stream, which were very radical, and which were dominated by the Islamic world, very, very anti-Israel, and that coincided with I would say, the spread of what I would call basically radical hard left views into the universities of the West, which I think was a long planned process to subvert the core codes and traditions of the West from inside. So it was a kind of, it was called the Long March through the institutions. That was getting going in the 70s. And those two things, I think, and so those things came together, and human rights law, human rights culture became a thing. It became a thing on the progressive left. I remember, when Tony Blair came to power in 1979. Human rights was the big thing. It was going to create the brave new world in which prejudice would be excised from the human heart, and nations would no longer do war, they would do law. And every global conflict, including and in particular the Middle East conflict, as it was called, which is actually the Arab War of Extermination against Israel, but that was reframed as a conflict over land, which had to be, like every other conflict in the world, was susceptible to negotiation and compromise, because basically everybody in the world wanted the same thing as everybody else. They wanted just to live in peace and all the rest of it. And so you found common ground. There's always common ground you could find. So you negotiate with fanatic lunatics, of course, because there's common ground, because they're not fanatic lunatics. Because we in the West, this was I think the thinking behind it, we in the West who've invented the human rights culture, we in the West know that everyone thinks like us, because our views are universal. They're universally applicable, and the primacy of reason, and therefore the primacy of the ability to compromise on everything, is hardwired into all of us. Disaster. You reframe a war of extermination against Israel as a conflict over land boundaries. You will empower the people who wish to exterminate Israel. And that's what's happened over many years. So those things became, the human rights, I would say culture, it was like an ideal of creating the brotherhood of man through this, of creating a new world, answerable to law, not war, no violence, no killing. It was the John Lennon imagine. Imagine a world in which, there are no divisions, it's all fine. That was Blair. And he was simply reflecting a mood that had arrived, descended, I think, mainly through the universities. He didn't invent this. He was a prime expositor of it, but he had the power to make it real. And so in law, he introduced the human rights culture into Britain in a big way, because that's what he was doing. He was creating a new society, year zero.
So you want to abolish the United Nations?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Of course. It is the epicenter of evil in the world. People don't realize this. It's the epicenter.
Wow. So you really put it at the feet of the United Nations, all of this?
Yes. The United Nations and Hamas are in bed together.
Okay, now you have to explain that to me.
The United Nations is...
Because I haven't seen them saying they're in bed together. I mean, the United Nations are not pro-Hamas.
Yes, they are.
Well, okay.
Oh, yes, they are.
Convince me.
Mr. Guterres, however you pronounce his name, who is the Director General of the UN.
Yeah.
On October 7, said basically, terrible what happened, but, it's Israel's fault. It's the United Nations. The supposed crucible of peace and justice in the world. The arbiter of peace and justice in the world. That's where they started. Then you look at what they have done over Israel. It is astounding. The UN Human Rights Council is a joke. It has kleptocracies and tyrannies on the Human Rights Council all the time. It has a standing order, as it were, to treat Israel quite differently from any other country. Israel, the one democracy in the Middle East, has had more resolutions against it at the Human Rights Council of the United Nations than I think all the other countries of the world put together. Just imagine, the one democracy in the Middle East, all those terrible tyrannies, this is insane. I can go through this, UN staff, not just anti-Israel, but profoundly anti-Semitic. They make these appalling anti-Semitic comments, and they go on and on. Come to October 7, and the focus is on the United Nations Relief and Works Department, UNRWA, which administers humanitarian aid, schools, aid in Gaza. And what do we find? We find, long story short, that thousands of them are Hamas operatives. They're Hamas operatives. And the UN denies it. It supports them. They are the UN. They are the UN. And, we found, was it last week, the week before, the Israelis found a major Hamas terror center in a UN, in an UNRWA, either school or medical facility. The hospitals are all UNRWA, are all Hamas terror facilities. What the Israelis have found. The UN is silent about this, but also says it's all lies. When I say silent, it has never admitted it to any of it. It's never expressed any concern, despite copious evidence. So that's why I say the UN is in bed with Hamas. And when you look at, the conflicts in the rest of the world, the UN, look at Syria, Russia. The idea that Russia and China have a Security Council presence which can affect the binding decisions of the United Nations, this is insane. How can you have Russia and China in such a position? How can you have countries like Iran in such a position in the human rights part of the UN? Does no one sit and actually think about this? People do, but it's like an inertia, because people are still fixated on this idea that in order to have global peace and justice, you must have a global institution. Well, no, if most of the countries of the world are tyrannies and kleptocracies and deniers of human rights and genocidists and imperialists and rogues of one kind or another, if you have a global body It's going to be dominated by these people. So how can that global body ever be the arbiter of peace and justice? On the contrary. So the break on this is this in the Security Council, the veto power of America. All right? Okay. So that has prevented the worst of this from taking place in terms of Security Council resolutions by bad people being thwarted. Okay. But nevertheless, you've got the rest of the UN, which is regarded as the arbiter of peace and justice. And for much of the West, and certainly for the entire progressive part of the West, but also the non-progressive part of the West, everyone accepts, just assumes that the UN is basically beneficent, a force for good in the world. It might be a little ineffectual, but a force for good. No.
You in your book, Londonistan, published in 2006, you describe an allergy to the concept of nationalism, or what might be described as patriotism or nation-statism in a sort of Westphalian sense. And so there was a cultural reach for something greater. And I can't remember the exact term that you use, is sort of a progressive reach away from anything that felt too parochial. And it seems to me that underlies why it will be controversial to hear you say abolish the UN, is because people are actually allergic to what the alternative I think you're suggesting or implicitly suggesting, which is nation-statism.
Yes, I know. People are very allergic to it. People think that the nation state is the source historically of war, which is true. Wars were fought between nations. That's undeniably true. They also think, and this is sort of separate but related, that the Western nation state is a repository of all evil in the world. That the Western nation state is dominated by white people who are intrinsically racist and oppressive and colonialist, and so the Western nation state is the expositor of all these terrible things, and therefore, in order to abolish terrible things like prejudice and xenophobia and warmongering and violence between peoples, you abolish the nation. You abolish the nation state, but you supersede the nation state by a kind of carapace of internationalism.
Exactly.
And that has been the kind of on dit. That's been the sort of basic premise that the West has had for a long time. Now, so what am I saying? So people say, oh, so you want to return to the nation state, you want to return to war. Well, I want to return to the ability for a people to have self-determination and express that self-determination of its own culture through its own laws that it elects people to pass. And if that means that sometimes they are going to come up against aggressive other states aggressing against them, well, then they have to fight that aggression in whatever way they choose, not necessarily by military means. In the last analysis, in my view, unless you actually make the other person, unless you make the aggressor believe that you would, in the last resort, use military force, then you can't really get anywhere. But nevertheless, there are many things you can do before you get to military force. So basically, you defend your nation. If you can't defend your nation, you cannot defend the culture that's in that nation. If you are a liberal society based on liberal democracy, liberal democratic principles, which the West is, you cannot defend those principles in your nation if you don't have a nation. You can't defend them through universalism. There is no universal agreement on these things. You defend them in your territory, which you define through borders, which you police, governed by laws which you pass through your parliaments. That is the whole basis of national self-determination. So the people who say, oh, if you want a nation back, then if you want the primacy of the nation back, then you want to make war again. Well, no, I want the ability of people to live freely in accordance with their own culture. That's what I want. If they have to defend that against people who are aggressing against that, then they have to take measures, condign measures, economic or military, to defend it. you don't get anywhere by saying, you don't make a better world by saying, well, let's abolish the nation, because then you have not John Lennon's Imagine, you have a war of all against all in which the strong win over the weak, which is kind of what we're seeing. We're seeing a Europe which it subscribes to universalist principles, generally speaking. And what do we see? We see Putin's Russia, we see Xi's China, and they can't cope with it. They don't do war anymore. They only do law. They do negotiation and compromise. And they've got people who are saying, we can't believe how open this is for us. And Iran is saying, these people are crazy. But I mean, it's the opportunities for us are now legion. And that's why, partly why, all these mobs on the streets of London and other Western cities since October 7, they sense it. We've got them. That's what's behind these demonstrations. We've got them. We can see how weak they are. America is never going to do war again under Biden. Never. Iran has attacked dozens and dozens of times since October 7. American interests. America has fired back into empty warehouses. It has not taken the action it needs to defend itself. It will do nothing to upset its, this is mysterious to many people, but it wishes to protect and defend its relationship with Iran, which it sees as playing an important role in an emerging Middle East, and it will sacrifice Israel and indeed its own interests to that end. This is like crazy stuff.
I'm not sure I fully follow you on that.
No, neither do I, actually.
because America have supported Israel. It's precisely why Biden's been called Genocide Joe in some sense, and losing far left support in the States.
No, they haven't.
Well, how have they not?
Everything they've done is Janus-faced. It is entirely ambiguous. When Biden, yes, it's true, on October 7, Biden flew to Israel. He said, we stand by you. And he dispatched, I think it was 2 aircraft carriers to the region. And he said famously, apparently, to Iran or Hezbollah or anybody who was threatening Israel, don't. But he said don't to Israel. The don't was to Israel. The don't meant, we have your back. Don't do anything to upset our relationship with Iran. You don't have any need to attack Iran. You have no need to attack Iran's proxy army, Hezbollah, in Lebanon. Hezbollah in Lebanon have 150,000 missiles sighted among the civilian population, pointing at the whole of Israel. If Hezbollah really unleash, Israel will be unable to cope with the bombardment because it's a matter of the number of missiles and their range and their precision and their lethality makes what Hamas had look amateur. And when October 7 happened, Israel's first reaction after it had got hold of what was going on in southern Israel, which took several days, to stop the carnage there, immediately the Hezbollah started unleashing across the border. People in this country, in Britain, have no idea what's going on because nobody ever tells them here. The media are silent. There is a constant bombardment by the Hezbollah in southern Lebanon against the border towns of northern Israel, and in the last few days, getting more and more south. The Hezbollah are calibrating it very carefully to provoke Israel only so far, because the Hezbollah do not want Israel to destroy southern Lebanon, because the Hezbollah, unlike the Hamas, really are dependent on the population to support them, and they don't want to upset that. Hezbollah is Iran's proxy army, but they also have an independent status. So they're a bit different from the Hamas, which are Iran's proxy army in Gaza. But the fact is that there are hundreds of thousands of Israelis, families, both in the south and in the north, who have been unable to be in their homes for the last 8 months. They are refugees inside the country. And that's because they are continuously being shelled and bombed by the Hezbollah in Lebanon. Israel's initial reaction, once they got a handle on what was going on in southern Israel, once they managed to stop the carnage by Hamas in southern Israel, their first reaction, their first instinct was to preempt Hezbollah by going to war against Hezbollah, because that's the great fear, because that can actually murder a very large number of Israelis. And America stopped it. And America has basically ever since, while hand on heart, we support Israel in its attempt to defeat the Hamas. They must defeat the Hamas. They must root the Hamas out. They must kill Sinwar. They must release the hostages. It's done everything it can to stop that. It has forced Israel to slow down at a great expense of Israeli lives, young men and women who are in combat. They are dying because they are forced not to fight the war in the way that benefits them. They've been forced all the time to prioritize America's priorities, which are civilian life in Gaza. You must bring in humanitarian aid, ignoring the fact that most of that aid has gone to the Hamas itself. And you must not hit the Hezbollah more than kind of tit-for-tat retaliation, and you must not attack Iran, and so on and so forth. Now, I mean, they've been micromanaging the war. They've been sending over Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and people from the NSC and all kinds of people who are basically dictating to Israel how to win this war, how to wage this war. And it seems to many Israelis, and it certainly seems to me, that while the Biden administration certainly does not wish to have thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of Israelis murdered on its watch, it does not wish to have it said that America facilitated a genocide. So it will prevent that from happening, but it will also prevent Israel doing what it needs to do. Because for America, in the architecture that it sees in the Middle East, Iran plays a very important role, and so does the Hamas.
That's under the current administration. It's a very different story under Trump. But that's a whole other kettle of fish. A couple of days ago, the president of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, was killed in a helicopter accident. What do you think that does to the conflict? What's your take on that?
I can't tell you. I'm not that sort of expert. I mean, it seems to have been an accident. It will affect how it will affect Iran in the Iranian position. I can't tell you. I just don't know. But what it might do is be, and this is what the Iranians are really concerned about, the regime is really concerned about. It was very interesting. When news came through that he had been killed, there were huge celebrations by the Iranians, the Iranian people, fireworks, and the Iranian regime seemed to be amassing its own internal forces in order to preempt any kind of demonstrations, because this is a point of danger for the regime. The death of somebody who is regarded, well, his nickname was the Butcher of Tehran. The death of somebody who has oppressed, has presided over the oppression, torture, incarceration, and killing of so many Iranians could be the spur for a much greater push by the people who will say, he's dead, now we've got to get the regime out. And this is a point of danger for the regime, and it's a point of great optimism for everybody else in the world who is decent, who wishes the regime to fall. So I don't know how it's going to work out. I mean, I have absolutely no idea, I'm afraid. I just, beyond my pay grade.
So there's a slight, on the same sort of topic, but slight sidestep. But seeing as you live in Jerusalem, I'm interested for an Israeli perspective on this. This is something I've asked a couple of guests before, which is from Israel's point of view in this war. The current means of trying, also as we speak, there's the movement towards Rafah by Israeli forces. It seems to me that the danger of this current strategy, there's two main ones. Firstly, that Israel end up unintentionally killing what hostages are left alive in Gaza. And two, even if they defeat Hamas on paper, even if they get rid of many Hamas militants, the ideology of Hamas is only, if anything, it would support the ideology. It sort of proves the ideology, depending how you take it. On the other hand, and this is something that you alluded to earlier in this conversation, when how America should deal with Iran about sanctioning and getting towards the leadership, we know that Hamas leadership are currently in Qatar. The British sanctioned the Russians at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war. It seems to me that, or at least my question would be, why isn't it that there's been an attempt to deal with the leadership in Qatar and force Qatar's hand, which seems to be, and get rid of the leadership of Hamas that are there? That seems to me a more logical approach to this war than the conflict in Gaza. Sorry, that's a bit of a muddled question, but I wondered if you have insight into why that wasn't the approach.
There's a lot in what you say. Israel has regarded Qatar as a kind of interlocutor. Israel has made many mistakes, and that's one of them.
Yeah.
Israel's mistakes, however, are made kind of almost always because it feels it has no alternative. So we can all argue about that with 2020 hindsight vision. But the fact is that after October 7, the war in Gaza could have been stopped at birth if America had said to Qatar, you've got 24 hours. You call off Hamas, you throw them out of Doha, you call them off, and you get them to return every hostage now. Otherwise, you're out of here. We no longer will support you. We will no longer have you anywhere near us. We will cut off all your benefits. The war would have finished immediately before it was even started. So why hasn't America done that? You tell me. I mean,
maybe there's something we don't know.
I don't know, but I would suspect. I mean, Qatar, it's not just America. In Britain, I mean, Qatar has, over many years, infiltrated itself into our societies in the West. It's financed a vast amount of stuff. I mean, there are many, many universities which are financed by Qatar. Football clubs, stadiums, whatever. And everybody thought Qatar was basically okay, because nobody actually cared about the fact that it founded Hamas, basically. It sheltered, Sheikh Qaradawi, who was the principal early spiritual mentor of Hamas. And it still runs Hamas. They are the same thing. So this is like madness. So you're entirely right. And I can only assume it's a paradigm that the West adopted, which was like many other paradigms. And Israel was part of that. Netanyahu was part of that. Regarding Qatar as, the least worst, and therefore we can use them, and we have to have some sort of interlocutor with the Hamas. You can see how sort of pragmatically a politician gets himself into that kind of situation. 2020 hindsight, it was madness, but we are where we are, and they could stop it now, but they don't. Okay. You say the Hamas ideology can't be defeated, and kind of, they're in.
Some
Rafah.
people argue against that and would say, look, we defeated Nazi ideology,
right.
We defeated Japanese imperialism. But it strikes me that this is a little bit different. One obvious example it's different is it's religious. It's tied in with Islamism.
For sure. But the idea that, first, yes, you're right and you're wrong. The idea that Islamism is fueled by despair. That if Israel smashes the Hamas, that the anger will be so great that you'll have many, many more volunteering to be martyrs and the rest of it. No, it doesn't. That's not how it works. That's not how it works. What inspires Islamists, and has inspired them ever since the Iranian Revolution happened in 1979, is the prospect of victory, the success. They're inspired by killing, by defeating the enemy, whether it's the West, whether it's Israel. That's what fuels them. We're almost there. We're almost there. Now, so conversely, what depresses them in every sense is defeat. Now, you're absolutely right. You can't defeat the ideology of Hamas. What is the ideology of Hamas? It's not a particular ideology unto itself. The ideology of Hamas is the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas is part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood is an organization, a movement, which is it operates through. It's highly decentralized. It operates through little institutions, charities, voluntary groups, mosques, and it's all over the West. And that's how it carries jihad, whether it's violent jihad in certain circumstances or whether it's infiltrationist jihad to take over a culture. But that's what it's at. So, of course, you can't defeat Hamas's ideology. It's the Brotherhood. And the Brotherhood is everywhere, and it will continue. What you can do, and what the Israelis, as far as I can see, what they're trying to do, is to defeat it in Gaza as a military force so that never again can Hamas in Gaza or any other terrorist entity do to Israel what it did on October 7, or worse. That's its limited aim. And my goodness, that's hard enough because Hamas is very deeply rooted, literally, physically. I mean, it's underground. So it's a very, very difficult thing to pull off. I don't know whether they're going to be able to pull it off, but let's assume they do pull it off. Let's assume, and they say they're in Rafah. I mean, as of today, there are stories which I believe to be true that Israel has downgraded its war aim in Rafah under pressure from the Americans. The Americans have put enormous pressure on Israel, threatening to abandon them at the UN, threatening to cut off arms, echoed by the mini-me in the Foreign Office, David Cameron, threatening them. If you go into Rafah, we will cut you off. They don't want them to go. They don't want them to win. Okay. So Israel is trying to defeat the remaining battalions in Rafah with basically one arm at least tied behind its back, but it's trying to defeat it in Rafah. Right. I don't know whether it's going to succeed. Fine. Let's assume it does succeed. Let's assume that it achieves its war ends to prevent the Hamas from ever again posing a military threat to the citizens of Israel. It will then have defeated a principal weapon of war of Iran. And that will have a knock-on effect because it will be a tremendous setback for Iran. That's why Iran is going to these enormous lengths to stop it. Because it can't have that without sustaining great damage to its own aims of regional domination, of war against the West, of the extermination of Israel, and so on. And, the Hezbollah is looking at what's been done already in Gaza, and is looking at whether Israel is going to win this. Because if it doesn't win it, if it's perceived to have lost, if Sinwar can arise and say, I'm here, I'm still here, and we're going to continue, then Hezbollah is going to say, right, we're still in business, lads. If the Hezbollah looks at Gaza and sees, hypothetically, Sinwar is dead, the Hamas is finished in Gaza as a military force, do we in the Hezbollah want that to happen to us? No. So everything gets put back to a certain extent into its box. Now, is that a long-term solution to this terrible conflict that goes on in the Middle East? No. That's another matter. But in terms of there's no point in defeating the Hamas because you can't defeat them, which is an argument that I hear all the time. I think that is a fundamental misreading of how things work in the Islamic world and in the Middle East.
The other thing that seems, you might have more insight than me, that if, let's say, Israel do defeat the military wing of Hamas, they will now have to occupy Gaza.
The day after.
And so it's a nightmare that will continue.
It is a nightmare
forever. And maybe it's a question of, well, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But then it's almost we're going back in circles round, and these things perpetuate.
I hear you. And this is a matter of great concern. Netanyahu, whether you like him or not, you have to sort of listen to what he's saying. He has said two things. First of all, he has said the day after is for the day after. First of all, we have to defeat the Hamas. And that is a big undertaking. And it may take months. It may take a long, long time. I mean, I don't know how long it took the Americans to defeat ISIS in Mosul, but it took a long time. And Mosul was like a piece of cake compared with what's going on in Gaza. So that's the first thing. First things first. Okay. And we'll talk about the day after. But he has talked about the day after, Netanyahu, actually. And everybody has gone sort of, oh, for goodness sake, it's ridiculous. Okay, but he has talked about it. And what he has said is there has to be in place. We don't want to be in Gaza. The Israelis do not want to be in Gaza. And we're not going to have a Palestinian state. This is what the Americans want. They want a Palestinian state in Gaza, and they want it run by the Palestinian Authority. Now, the Palestinian Authority is itself highly complicit in all of this. First of all, the biggest party in the Palestinian Authority, so-called moderate Palestinian Authority, run by Mahmoud Abbas, so-called moderate statesman. The biggest party, which is Fatah in the Palestinian Authority, whose leader or chairman, whatever he is Mahmoud Abbas. Fatah has said over and over again, what a wonderful thing happened on October 7. We want many more October 7s, and so on. That's the first thing. Second thing is that Palestinian Authority police officers have been involved in atrocities since October 7 against Israelis. Third thing is that the Palestinian Authority is not moderate. It tells the West something in English.
It's moderate compared to Hamas?
No.
No,
actually.
not even?
No. It wears a suit, so it's thought of as moderate. You look at what the Palestinian Authority teaches its children, and when I say children, I mean generations that are now adults and grandfathers and grandmothers. It teaches them to hate Jews as Jews. It teaches them that their highest calling is to murder Jews and to destroy Israel and to steal its land. It doesn't say steal, it says take the land. What do they mean? They don't mean the so-called occupied territories. They don't mean Gaza. Israel isn't in Gaza. They mean Tel Aviv, Haifa, Jaffa, the lot. Because that's the agenda. And the complicity of the Palestinian Authority's people with terror over years and still today, the activities of the Palestinian Authority in inciting hatred of Jews and using Nazi-style language to do so, hatred of Jews and the desire to murder Israelis and to take their land, the whole of their land, it's not a secret. It's not a secret. And yet the Americans want to put the PA into Gaza to run it. Now, Netanyahu has said, I'm not having that. So we don't want to be in Gaza running it. We're not having the PA running it. So like who? Good question. So Netanyahu says, we want ordinary Gazans who are not Hamas, but who are not the PA. We want ordinary Gazans to run Gaza. Now, what does that mean in practice? I can't tell you. But he has said that. He has said that. And I think either he has said or people have surmised that Gaza could be run under a kind of administration governed by, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. The trouble is, they don't want anything to do with the Palestinians. They hate them. Egypt goes to enormous lengths. It's built a wall. It refuses to send any aid across the crossings. Egypt has sealed the crossing. People don't realize Egypt has a border with Gaza. They hate the Palestinians. They want them gone. They won't want anything to do with them. This is a big problem. Anyway, it's somewhere in that region that you can see an administration of Gaza taking place. In other words, we hope that ordinary Gazans, for whom Hamas has been a disaster, they've robbed them blind, they're corrupt, they kill them, they incarcerate them. It's just tyranny. So we hope that ordinary Gazans could be found to run it decently. We hope. That's, I think, what Netanyahu is getting at, under some sort of international, confabulation, a regional confabulation of people who can basically sort out the nonsense if it starts again. I don't know.
My personal hope would be someone like the Emiratis stepping up. They've been absolutely phenomenal. If we can get back to the Abraham Accords,
exactly,
that to me is where there's hope. There's a great example.
That's the route to peace.
That's the route to peace. If you've written a lot about Islam and Muslims in the West, and obviously, of course, Israel. To me, if you need a better example, there is no better example of the possibility of peace and trade and neighborliness with a Muslim nation than the Emiratis.
I agree. The Emiratis. Leave aside Qatar, which is a problem. The Emiratis...
But Qatar are part of that same axis of evil. Iran, Russia,
yes, I know.
Hamas.
But they're all... People talk about the Gulf states, but, Qatar is different. So Saudi Arabia, Emiratis, that's the route to peace. Now, what the Americans are doing, which is so wicked, it is really wicked, they are dangling over Israel the prospect of the peace that we all want through Saudi Arabia. They're dangling that with the price that it comes through a Palestinian state governed by the PA. In other words, if you want peace with Saudi Arabia, we Americans are going to facilitate that, provided that you agree that what's established in Gaza is an administration that's going to murder you again. Because the Americans are obsessed with the two-state solution.
I mean, the Americans, I would say it's the Biden administration, the Blinken, and it's going back to an Obama worldview towards Iran. I really don't think that was the case under Trump with Jared Kushner, but that maybe is a whole other conversation.
They're looking back over many decades, many administrations. They've all had this belief that it's a fight over land boundaries, the division of land. No American administration has ever said this is a war of extermination against Israel, and we will treat the Palestinians accordingly. If that had happened, none of this would be happening. This whole thing has been facilitated by the West, treating a war of extermination as a platform for compromise over land, as a result of which they have facilitated, encouraged, sanitized, and funded the people bent on extermination. If that were to stop, this whole thing would stop. But no one sees that. No one accepts it. Everyone's obsessed by this, it's two-state solution. It's a great answer. It's a great answer. But it's the answer to the wrong question. If that was a solution, two states, it could have been had in the 1930s when it was first offered. It's been offered to the Palestinians over and over again by Israel. Every time the Palestinians have refused and have instead murdered Israelis, waged war. And the West says, oh, no, two-state solution. Israel standing in the way. This is, to me, crazy. It's like, I'm not going to even acknowledge the reality because it's just too difficult. And it gets in the way of my core beliefs that every problem is susceptible to negotiated compromise. So, of course, war of extermination, nonsense. This is a fight over land. It's not. And as a result, we are where we are.
There's someone that's come up fleetingly in this conversation that I think might be a way of tying a few of the different threads we have together and maybe taking it to a couple of other questions or topics I hope we can address.
This is like a fractal.
You mentioned David Cameron, and you have previously said, I think recently at the National Conservative Conference, that it is not surprising that David Cameron, who bet the farm on the UK staying in the EU and lost, David Cameron is the Conservative who has most venomously turned on Israel the paradigm nation state. Now, I tie this together not only because we're talking about Israel, but because also we talked earlier about nation statism, nationalism, and the Conservative Party in this country have completely bought into the supranational ideology away from nationism, or if you can call it, I know I'm sort of making up words here as we go along, but I'm curious, firstly, by what you mean by David Cameron turning on Israel, but I'm also curious to understand what your take is on the kind of dire end of, it seems like, the Conservative Party, who are heading towards electoral obliteration.
They are indeed connected. Cameron seems to me to be a universalist. The idea that universalism, which is the creed of the left, is only confined to the left, the political left, I think is wrong. A number of people who consider themselves to be conservative, call themselves conservative, and certainly are in the Conservative Party in this country, are universalists. And Cameron's one of them, which is why he was a Remainer, why he fought against Brexit and so on and so forth. Now, he has been using, for a long time now, I don't know, several months. His language has become much more, I would say, venomous against Israel. By venomous, I mean he's turned on Israel in an unconscionable way by repeating the lies. For example, the lie that they are wantonly killing people, that the civilian casualties in Gaza are terrible, that they are thwarting humanitarian aid from coming in, without any kind of context that, the occasions when humanitarian aid has been thwarted is because it's not humanitarian aid at all. It could be used for nefarious purposes, or that Hamas are stealing it, or that Hamas are firing on the crossing points, or whatever. No, Israel is stopping humanitarian aid. I mean, this is a lie, and killing too many people. We've talked about that. Yeah. The opposite is the case. Now, how can he put out these lies, which not only hurt Israel, weaken Israel by Britain turning against it in this way, but also incite antisemitism? They incite hatred of Jews on the assumption that all Jews are responsible for Israel, which is a common assumption. Every time in recent decades, every time Israel is portrayed as doing terrible things to the Palestinians, even though it's based on lies, people believe it, and the attacks on Jews in this country, both verbal and physical, they spike immediately. So there's a direct line between the lies told about Israel and incitement to Jew hatred in this country. He knows that. If he doesn't know it, he's an idiot. But that's certainly the effect of what he's doing. And this to me is unconscionable. Now, to a certain extent, you could say, well, the British government has toughened up its rhetoric generally because it's marching in lockstep with the Biden administration, which itself turned on Israel much more openly in the last 2 or 3 months. So you could say that. But to me, it is part of a general view, which is that Israel's great crime to people who hold to universalist principles is that Israel is the paradigm nation state. Israel actually, or the Jewish people, created the template for the nation state in ancient Judea, in ancient Israel, because it was a nation governed by its own laws in its own land, geographically defined, for which they fought. And that was consciously taken up by all kinds of people, including the British. Ancient Britain, the kings and queens and the monarchs of ancient Britain patterned themselves on this. It's why there are rituals from ancient Judaic rituals in the coronation ceremony. In America, they patterned themselves on this precise template. So it's of going back into antiquity, it was the paradigm nation state. And it is now the paradigm nation state in a world in which received opinion says the Western style nation state, the Westphalian nation state, is an abomination. It's the cause of war, it's the cause of prejudice, and all those terrible things. And here's Israel. And not only is it a nation state, not only is it like a pattern on the West, but my goodness me, it's defined by ethnicity. It's a Jewish nation state. Can't have that. The fact that it's a Jewish nation state means by definition it is exclusive, it is therefore vile. Okay, now it is a Jewish nation state, but the people who say that are saying that the Jews are not a nation. These are people who basically don't realize that the Jewish people is a nation. It's not just a religion. It's a people, a nation, and a religion defined in antiquity by land. They don't realize that it is although it's a Jewish nation state, 20% of the population is Arab with full civil rights. They don't understand that it's not white, that most...
Yeah, you go to Israel, you just see it's like most multiracial...
Most Jews are brown-skinned because most of them came from Arab lands, because there was an ethnic cleansing of 850,000 Jews who were thrown out, ethnically cleansed, persecuted, and thrown out after the State of Israel was created. And 20% are Arab, and then a number of other people. So the vast majority of Israelis are brown or black-skinned. Excuse me. Okay, fine. So, nevertheless, Israel offends against the idea that there shouldn't be a nation-state defined by ethnicity. That's a terrible thing. And the Conservative Party, coming back to your question, I don't think the Conservative Party as a whole thinks very much about Israel.
Well, my bigger concern isn't necessarily their approach to Israel, though I am concerned. It's more that...
Yes.
And I tell you why it's actually is because Israelis have a great concept of nationhood. And so because of that self-confidence, I'm not worried about that. My bigger concern is that Britons do not.
Correct.
And so what does that mean for the future of Britain?
Britons do. That's why they voted for Brexit.
Right.
Okay. And much of the shock of the very significant part of the Conservative Party, which regards that as evidence of extremism or possibly insanity. That's where the Conservative Party has got to. It doesn't understand any...
But it's not just a Conservative Party, it's all major parties, Lib Dem, Labour and Conservatives.
Well, put them to one side because they are... progressive politics has bought in completely to this universalism, is the way we've been discussing. But it's in the Conservative Party too. So what are they conserving? They're not conserving anything. That's their essential problem. In order to conserve, they have to conserve... conservatism, seems to me, conservatism is more a state of mind or an approach to life than anything else. It's not an ideology per se. Conservatism is about literally conserving what is most valuable in a society or a culture. And the Conservative Party as a whole lost the plot when it failed to understand that what is most valuable about the nation of Britain is the nation, and that it has to preserve and conserve the things that make it a nation, which mean the traditions, the laws, the way of life, which everybody shares to a large extent, and which gives them all a common sense of marching together with a common purpose. And that isn't something to be taken for granted. It's been eroded by the attacks on the core beliefs of Western civilization. It's been attacked by the growth of universalism and all those things. Now, the Tories, I mean, they're not for nothing where they're called the stupid party. They really, really, really are stupid. And I remember thinking at the time, the Berlin Wall fell. Soviet communism was no more. Hurrah! For sure. I remember the Conservative Party saying, what do we do now? Our fox has been shot. And what do we do? And here is this guy Blair, and he's like on our turf. He's really a conservative. I mean, where are we going to go? What's our cause? And I remember them saying, it's quite clear. Our cause now is liberty. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, are they ever wrong? Because the left was propounding individualism, liberty for the individual, in the social sphere. My lifestyle, my truth is mine, and it's no worse or better than your truth, your lifestyle. Right, that was the left. Liberty, individual choice in everything. And here are the conservatives saying, individual choice, liberty. I mean, the conservatives expressed it in economics. They could only think in terms of economics. They could only think in terms of money. So everything was the market. And, it was said of Mrs. Thatcher. She thought if everything in Britain was run like Marks and Spencer, everything would be absolutely terrific. No sense of tradition. Tradition, she thought, was a kind of conspiracy against the market. Everything was the market. Everything was the individual. Everything was freedom. Wrong, wrong, wrong. That's where the Conservatives went completely wrong. They failed to understand you had to conserve the traditions and codes and borders of the country, because the nation is what you had to conserve. And the nation was under assault. They never understood it. Many of them still don't understand it.
It seemed like for one moment in 2019, yes, when Boris won that election, it seemed like maybe they understood what you're talking about now.
No, they understood that Boris was going to win them elections.
But why did Boris win that election?
Because Boris spoke to the people. Boris spoke to the people who are basically conservative with a small c, many of whom voted Labour, the famous Red Wall. Mm-hmm. But they're basically conservative. They want to conserve their traditions, their way of life, their culture, their neighbourhood, their attachments. They're attached. These are people who are attached profoundly to their locality, their family, their locality, and the nation. Whereas Universalists are, in David Goodhart's immortal phrase, citizens of everywhere, or citizens of nowhere. They can be anywhere. Boris understood this. He connected with those people, both in the Red Wall and in the shires or conservative areas, but who get this. And then, we all saw what happened. He was seen to have betrayed all that. He didn't really mean it. He was himself, he blew himself up. Okay. So people were very disillusioned. So now, if they're that kind of person, whether in the Red Wall or not the Red Wall, they're looking around, and what do they see? They see David Cameron prancing around with his universalist message. They see Rishi Sunak, who kind of he's a bean counter. He's very efficient. He's very clever. And what does he actually stand for? What does he actually want? What's his vision of the good society? What's his vision of Britain? No one knows. Is he a universalist? Is he a national state man? No one knows. Okay. So there's a kind of vacuum, and the cultural mood music is the people who voted for Brexit, or the politicians who supported Brexit. They're all basically mad. They're off the wall. There's Nigel Farage. They're terrible. It's Viktor Orban on steroids. It's xenophobia. It's terrible things. They're all hearing this. And then they look to Labour and they see somebody who's a universalist who is pretending not to be, and they think he's just pretending. I don't trust him for a moment. Where do they go?
They're not voting for him.
They've got nowhere to go.
Yeah. Well,
they
reform.
Are disenfranchised.
Going.
Okay, so reform. I mean, does anyone really take reform seriously? I don't. I don't think it's got what it takes. There's people who have small c conservative views based on their desire, their deep desire to live in a country they can call home, which they recognise. They recognise it because they recognise the traditions and the culture and the values and the laws that are particular to Britain, and the desire to defend itself through borders that are policed. They see all that's just gone. And they're desperate. Where do they go? I can't answer that. No one can answer that. No one knows how this is going to work. So by default, they may just, they may sit at home, in which case Labour wins, or they may vote for all kinds of small parties, in which case, who knows what's going to happen.
We're talking about the political there, which is where I pushed the conversation. But I'm also curious, not just about the political side, just about the cultural side of Britain, that anyone like yourself who stands up for nation statism or British values is shot down, is called all sorts of ridiculous things. So we have this culture where still, and we've talked about it several throughout this conversation, where you're pegged down if you're patriotic and written off, and it's so with that in mind, are you pessimistic or optimistic about the future?
If I was pessimistic, I wouldn't be continuing to write. I think everything is to play for. Do I think that Britain and the West are going to survive as what they once were? I can't tell you that. I've no idea. I know that if we stop fighting for that, then it is over. We have to fight. We have to behave as if everything is to play for. And I believe actually everything is to play for. I believe, there are cultures in history where they have died. Rome, Greece. So it happens. Great civilizations that you think will go on forever disappear. I also think about the louche and wild 18th century in Britain. And if you and I were sitting here in the 18th century in a coffee shop, we would be saying to each other, it's over. It's finished. Look, Hogarthian scenes outside.
Or indeed the 17th century.
Women in the gutter, drunk, gin, illegitimacy, marriage's gone. It's over. We're finished. And then it became the Victorian period. Hello? It happens. People pull back from the cliff. Now, I think with the right leadership, this country can pull back from the cliff. So can the West. There is no leadership that I can see at the moment, but in principle, with the right leaders, the thing can be turned around quite quickly. It needs somebody, by a leader, I mean somebody who understands what I've just been talking about, i.e. someone who agrees with me. Fine. Okay, fine.
Melanie, why aren't you standing up? Why aren't you running
okay,
for...
fine. Right. Put aside my monomania for a moment. But somebody who really does get it and who doesn't, lurch into, authoritarianism on the other side, doesn't go over to the other side and become someone who negates a decent society. But somebody who understands what it takes. So, you've got to transform the education system. You've got to re-incentivize traditional marriage. Hello, mother, father, children. Sorry. Okay, doesn't mean you've got to be beastly to everybody else. No, it just means you've got to say, this is the best way we can ever devise of people being happy and fulfilled and emotionally healthy. So, excuse me, that is the best way. And, we've got to be nice to everybody else, but we've got to prioritize this because otherwise we're collectively dead. Okay, birth rate. This country is literally dying, like most Western countries.
I've done episodes on that, on the birth crisis.
So interestingly,
yeah,
the one Western style country, which is bucking this trend, the only one, as far as I can see, is Israel. Okay? The entire West is dying, indigenously dying. It's not replacing itself. It's having to import people to keep its essential services running. Was it 1.6 children per woman is the replacement rate, something like that. Either 1.2 or 1.6. I can't quite remember.
It's anyway. 2.1. It's over 2 for the replacement.
2.1. Whatever it is. 2. Whatever it is. Okay, fine. Israel is nearly 4 children per woman. So everybody goes, oh yeah, like it's the ultra-Orthodox, they're all having 1 million children. Well, yes, they are having 1 million children, although their birth rate has come down from 12 per woman to a mere 8. Okay. But the fact is that it's not the ultra-Orthodox that are pushing this. It's population in general. Now, why are they pushing it? Because all the attributes are in place for a Western-style birth rate to collapse, because people think, well, the birth rates collapsed in the West because of the empowerment of women. Women's priorities have changed. They're working. They're educated. They don't want children. They want children. Okay, that's why. No, that's not the reason. That's all the case in Israel too. Very much so. Very, very much so. The women work. The key, in my view, is that the country knows what it is, it values what it is, it's attached to its traditions, it wants to perpetuate those traditions, it wants to have children to perpetuate the culture, the nation, the traditions. It has hope in the future. It is a country of such immense optimism, despite the fact it is surrounded by enemies, currently fighting on 7 fronts simultaneously. It is still one of the most happy and fulfilled countries in the world. And all that gets translated into, we want to continue. We want to collectively continue. We understand the collective endeavour. We don't just understand it. We don't just know what we are. We value it. We value it so highly, we will die for it. We are dying for it today. Now, that's what Britain has to become again. That's what the West has to become again. To value itself, to want to perpetuate itself, to want to defend itself. Sounds a very tall order. It can be turned round quite quickly. People want this. They want to be optimistic. They don't want to think that everything is terrible. They don't want to be depressed. They want to have hope in the future. They want someone to give them the hope in the future. They want to be attached. They don't like being randomless atoms in the universe of nations, where not really nations at all, whirling around, and genuflecting to the United Nations and the International Criminal Court. They don't want that. So give them what they want, because what they want is good, wholesome, healthy, and will save their nation and Western civilization. It's quite simple. It's not rocket science. History teaches us this. Tall order? Absolutely. Impossible? Absolutely not.
I love a moment of hope to finish my episode.
That's me.
As I suspected, Melanie, we didn't even get to a fraction of the questions or even topics that I wanted to get into. I want to push readers. You've written so many great books. You are a prophet, as far as I'm concerned. Londonistan, which is nearly 20 years old, could have been written yesterday, or post-October 7th. Every chapter, from the Red-Green Alliance, I think you call it Red-Black Alliance, to multiculturalism, are issues today just as important as they were 20 years ago. The Sex Change Society, which you have to republish, because reading it today with the eyes of today, 25 years after, I could do a whole episode with you just on that, and hopefully we can do that in the future.
It's a date.
I want to say thank you so much, and is there anywhere that you'd like listeners to find you?
Yes.
What?
Thank you for mentioning this.
Yes.
I have a website where all my work is showcased, is stored. It's melaniephillips.substack.com. And I have an email list. You can join the email list. I will send you, therefore, you get sent automatically my work as it's published on the website, or you can just go to the website and read it all. You can read most of it for free, some of it only for a small payment. But that's where you can find me, melaniephillips.substack.com.
Wonderful. I also hope, as you suggested before we were rolling, that you have finished a new book.
I have.
That's about to be published. Are listeners allowed to know the title?
The title is The Elephant in the Room. You will have to read it to find out what the elephant is. I've just finished it last week, and the manuscript is now with my agent. So watch this space.
How very excited. I hope that when you publish, we can talk again. I'd also love to get into your personal story, which we talked about a little bit before recording, that I'm always keen to understand how people like you are able to so courageously say the difficult thing that no one else has the courage to say. And that to me is very interesting. But we went so deep that I think it's too big a topic to start just like that now. But Melanie Phillips, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about, at such length, to speak about life, the universe, and everything.
Thank you for watching The Winston Marshall Show. If you enjoyed that episode, well, I encourage you to like, share, and subscribe. You can also find us on all podcast outlets if you want just the audio, and of course on winstonmarshall.co.uk. Thanks for listening.